Okay, cool. So before I begin my speech, it's just going to be a bit of like the plain text in the background and then one advantage. Cool. My time starts now. Hello, judges. My name is Sam Yonker. I'll be the first affirmative speaker in today's resolution that the United States federal government should repeal the law stating that if a majority of workers in a bargaining unit vote for a union, then that union becomes the exclusive representation for all the workers in that bargaining unit. On to a bit of background and some top of case. First off, this is a policy round as indicated by a call to action in the resolution. Secondly, because of that, you should be judging today's debate right off the basis of net benefits. So whichever team provides the greatest amount of good or the greatest amount of net benefit should win today's debate round. And all definitions are going to be contextual unless asked during the PMC. Now, this moves me on to my plain text. The plain text is just going to be the resolution so that the United States federal government will repeal the law stating that if a majority of workers in a bargaining unit vote on a union, then that union becomes the exclusive representation for all the workers in that bargaining unit. This will happen through normal ways and means and will happen as soon as possible. Any questions? Cool. Moving on to a bit of background. Basically, Judge, what does this law do or what does this resolution mean? Basically, when you have a group of workers, when you have a group of people who want to get unionized, when 50% or slightly over, anything over 50% of these workers vote to have a specific union, it can be any union, be the official representation for them. This union basically becomes, whatever union they vote for, becomes the exclusive union, which can the only representative union for the entirety of the people, which the entirety of the voting block or the entirety of the bargaining unit. So we basically see that if 51% of people want to have a specific union, have that union represent them at a company, say Amazon, then that union becomes the exclusive representation for every single worker in that bargaining unit, regardless of whether or not they voted for that union. I'll get into why that's pretty problematic later, but there's just a brief overview of what's going on. This leads me into my first advantage, which you can tagline as representation. One, under this law, representation is very, very difficult for unions, for workers who might not necessarily want the majority union. The ace of point, there's two different reasons why. The ace of point is going to be that workers who are in the minority, specifically workers that don't want the specific union or the majority union, don't actually get any representation under that union when it becomes the exclusive representation for every single worker. We see this is pretty bad because take for example in Amazon, what's going on right now. Say there's packers and shippers. The packers control a majority of the control a majority of the voting block in that, or a majority of that voting block in all of the workers. And they can vote to have that a specific union, say for example, the Packers union be the exclusive representation, the exclusive union for the entire, all of the workers at Amazon, which means, say, for example, all the shippers who the union, which the Packers want, the Packers union says, no, we're not going to give you any representation. We're only going to focus on the rights of all the Packers, of the people who do packing at Amazon. We see this is really bad because basically all the people who do shipping in, say, for example, all the people who do shipping in want a raise, want to get more money from Amazon because they're getting underpaid by their employer. Basically, that union isn't going to represent them regardless of what happens because we see that the Packers are going to control a majority of that union and thus control a majority vote. The second point is that in a world where a majority isn't actually achieved, in a world where a majority isn't actually achieved by all the different employees who want for a union, basically no union is going to be selected. We also see this is going on in Amazon right now, specifically in Alabama. We see that workers aren't actually, or the workers' referendum is expected to fail for the Amazon workers for this exact reason, because not all the workers can agree on 50% of the workers. They can't get a majority to agree on a specific union. We see this is really bad because when this happens, basically there is no union whatsoever. And I'll get into why that's also really bad and why unions are really good later, but just keep that in mind. This exact thing is going on in Amazon right now. They're expected to fail to get the referendum to get a majority of votes in order to actually get the union they want or get any union whatsoever. Onto the links. The first link is they're going to be repealing this law, increases representation, and allows for minority representation, specifically for employees who want this. How is this going to happen, Judge? You may ask yourself. Well, there's this wonderful thing called multi-unions, or basically when multiple unions exist for different representations of people. So you see that a lot of different workers can basically select their own union in a specific block and in a specific union and have that union represent them, instead of just having one union which represents the entire company or represents, in this case, the entirety of the bargaining union. So we see a lot of times all of the Amazon workers will basically collapse into one bargaining unit, but in this world, we see that multiple different unions can cover different sections of workers and actually give them representation instead of only picking a singular union which has exclusive representation for the entirety of the workers. Second, the plan allows for multiple different unions. I just explained this, which is really, really good. And third, the plan stops issues like Amazon, the exact issue which is happening with Amazon, where workers can't agree or a majority of workers can't agree on a specific union. This basically stops the plan text. Repealing this law or repealing this bill stops that issue from happening. So there will actually be unions that can represent the people. There's no longer this majority threshold. Everyone can basically just pick their own union. Now, on to the impacts. Why is this a good thing? We see that more unions and more unionization representation is uniquely a really, really good thing. There are a couple of reasons why. The first, roughly unionized workers are roughly 11% more likely than their non-unionized counterparts to receive a pay increase. Additionally, unionized workers are really, really good for POC workers. The basic point is that Black workers represented by a union are paid roughly 13.7% than their non-unionized peers. The BSA point is that, yeah, you got a question?
Okay, thank you. Is there any real-life examples of successful multi-unions in a corporation?
Yes, actually, France. We see that France had basically had this exact issue happen, and then they passed this bill. The U.S. passed this bill in 2011, but it's basically where multiple different unions can basically join together to create a more effective, can actually increase their political power, because when you have different unions, they can basically band together in the French political system to represent all of the different workers' rights instead of just having one exclusive union which controls 100% of all of the workers, and oftentimes not giving the representation to a lot of the workers who actually need them. And lastly, we see that the unions are really good at reducing the gender gap. The Economic Policy Institute reports that labor unions are extremely effective at reducing the gender pay gap through systems of collective bargaining. A 2020 study conducted on school teachers found that collective bargaining policies by unionized teachers helped to reduce the gender pay gap significantly, specifically in that group of teachers, which were under a specific union. The second impact is going to be allowing for a variety of unions. Unions at all are better than no unions whatsoever. We see in a world like Amazon where a majority of workers can't actually agree on a union, having multiple different unions solves this issue, not just by just solving the issue at face, but actually gives back to the workers and allows workers to be advocating for their own union, increasing their own rights. So for the issues of increasing representation, as well as allowing for multiple different unions to exist in a specific workplace, I urge a strong vote for the affirmative. Thank you.
All right. Is everyone ready? Okay. Just as enough time roadmap, I'd like to rebut first and then go towards side opposition's main contentions. My speech will start in 3, 2, 1. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Madam Speaker, we think that side negative values effectiveness, values the protection of their workers, values actually getting things done rather than just meaningless representation, rather than just various diverse unions that cannot get anything done, that are ineffective and that are just there just to represent the people without getting anything done. Before going into any of our rebuttals or arguments, let us just make 2 clarifications. First of all, they claim that when there is no majority union, right, they will simply result in a state where they have no unions at all. However, ladies and gentlemen, we as side negative clearly propose right now that alternatively, when there is no union, we will keep on having votes until there is a majority union that emerges, and then that majority union will be the majority union and will have the power, have the exclusive power to represent that union within that corporation. Secondly, they give you the example of France as a successful example of unions. However, Judge, I clearly want to emphasize how France has been extremely ineffective in actually having effective union structures that actually represent the workers and actually protect their people. We clearly know that already in the status quo. France is famous for its draconic policies of extremely high taxes and a lot of violent clashes and protests between the workers, between the police, and between even police and the firemen. We think that this is the exact form of picture in the world that we will actually see if we follow side government's policy. Having these 2 things clarified, let us directly go to our team's rebuttals. Their entire argument is basically upon one idea, that representation is a very important value and is therefore a very crucial value that will win side of affirmative the debate. However, Judge, we have 2 clear rebuttals. Our first rebuttal is that representation is completely possible and is even better done under our structure of a single union. We think that this will be further elaborated with our third contention, but allow me to briefly explain. We think that representation is much better under a single union structure and is possible within a single union structure simply because in order for a single union to gain the majority of votes, to gain that amount of popularity, to beat that 50%, we think that they have to have policies of integration and having integration with other unions and other policies that other people like and other minorities groups like in order to get the amount of votes. We think that according to that check and balance, the first rebuttal here is that we think that amount of representation might not be as good as side negative, but we think that it's side affirmative, but we think that it's clearly possible also with side affirmative. On the other hand, we think that it's much more ineffective under side affirmative's case because now they have a various multi unions without that much power. That's why even if, yes, you get to represent anybody, because the amount of support and because the amount of power of each union is so low, the amount of strength or the amount of things that these unions can actually do with the representation is extremely low. That is why even if you have like 20 unions within that own country, corporation, if each union is not doing anything and each only has like 5% of each of the support, we clearly believe that this is worse than doing nothing at the end of the day. This is exactly why we're at least better, because we're the side that has not at least a form of representation, but we're the side that has unions that can actually get things done, that actually has power at the end of the day. Lastly, we think that we bite the bullet and we do agree that representation might be lacking on our side. However, we clearly argue that effectiveness of the unions are much more important. There are two impact reasons why this is the case. First of all, the purpose of unions themselves. The purpose of unions themselves are not just to represent the people. We think that the creation and the historical reason why unions are there is actually to protect the workers and to ensure these corporations are not abusing the rights of the people and the workers at the corporation. Therefore, if we actually prove that we're the side that actually gets things done and protects the workers, we think that we're the one that wins it in this clash. Secondly, we think that the impact of the time frame is clearly there, right? We think that when unions are ineffective and are just there without doing anything, we think that it's basically the workers that are harmed the most, the workers who are not getting any paid while they're going on strikes, right? This is why we think that effectiveness is a much more important structure to protect the workers at the end of the day. Having all of these arguments said, let us directly go on to our three arguments. Our first argument will be justification, secondly, effectiveness, and thirdly, check and balance. Directly towards our first argument, justification. We clearly believe that a majority rule is not necessarily a bad thing. We don't think that it's such an immoral thing that side affirmative wants to paint it as like they want to do. We think that a majority rule is a natural process that we already see in our society and the status quo within a democratic system, where a majority rule, where people vote for a system and that majority party gets immense power. We think that that's just a natural way of how democracy works and how society has decided for it to be a fair process of giving people the rights. Therefore, we see examples how not just in the presidency itself, Senate votes, House votes or whatnot. We think that the majority gets immense power over the minority at the end of the day. And we think that this isn't in it of itself a harmful thing and is just a principle of democracy that is actually there to make sure that the people are represented, that the majority of people actually get their values according to utilitarianism principles. That's why, first of all, we like to establish that the idea of majority rule of itself is not necessarily a big harm. But secondly, effectiveness. We think that, first of all, the purpose of unions in itself is to protect the rights of the workers. And we think that only by having a single union structure with an exclusive rights to represent the people is a much more effective structure. First of all, this is clearly because the benefits of a single united group simply outweighs the amount of power little diverse groups with little representation can have. Having a single group with that amount of people and with that amount of leverage, with that amount of structure, and with that amount of people that are supporting it will be much more effective in bargaining against corporations, against corporate leaders or whatnot. You have to understand the characteristic of these mega corporations in which that it is not an equal balance structure where the people do not have that amount of balance power to actually fight or to argue against the higher ups or the corporation in itself. This is clearly because the corporations have not only the rights to control their wages, their working conditions or whatnot. Therefore, we think that unions, the amount of power the unions have to have is crucial in order to create a better balance system that actually complements the mismatch system that we have in the status quo. However, when we see affirmatives world, we only see a structure when there's maybe a lot and a diverse amount of representation, but because of the simple lack of the support, lack of leverage that these individual corporation unions have, this is exactly why we think that it's ineffective for these unions to be able to represent its own workers and to protect its own people. But secondly, we think that it's also important to discuss ideas about union integrity. We think that often, as we see in the status quo, when minority unions and when a lot of that various unions are allowed to compete against this other, this creates an extremely competitive environment, which is extremely easy for these corporations to manipulate and take advantage of. For example, we see how Amazon has examples of using bots to like argue against unions and to create some people or supporters that do not like their unions. We think that this is extremely much more likely to happen in a structure when there's various amounts of unions that gates not a lot of power, but equal amounts of power amongst themselves. This is exactly when the corporation can play favorites and can pick pick various unions in order creating more chaos and creating more political instability, therefore lowering the amount of effectiveness that these unions can have. Our last argument will be about the check and balance, right? First of all, we clearly argued how we already have the benefits of diversity. In order to become the majority, you do not simply know that you have the 51% of the vote. You have to work politically to get the votes. You have to earn the votes of the people. Therefore, we think that when one union is forced to integrate with smaller unions, we think that this creates a structure where these unions will start to integrate other policies that are popular in order to get votes for other minority populations. This is exactly what we think that we also have the check and balance, resulting in the benefits of side affirmative, which was representation. Furthermore, we think that when it's just this hard balance between you don't know if it's going to be 51% and 49% and you're really at that stake, this discourages unions from being head-to-head between big two unions from fighting each other. This encourages unions to integrate and share policies that could actually benefit their people because they know too much is at stake to go to a big war. Therefore, we're more than happy to negate. Thank you.
My order is going to be the negatives, contentions in order. And then I will go over our contention. Cool. And you can start my 8 minutes of time now. Hello, Judge. My name is going to be Rohan Saptif. I'm going to be the second affirmative speaker in today's resolution. The United States federal government should repeal the law stating that if a majority of union workers, or a majority of workers in a bargaining unit vote for a union, then the union becomes the exclusive representative for all the workers in the bargaining unit. I'd like to start first with the majority rule argument, which my opponents made. They try to tell you that democracy and upholding the 51% system is good because it mimics the presidential system, the Senate system, and is inherently democratic. However, I have a couple of responses. The first response is we tell you that their characterization of democracy in this instance is correct. Democracy in the status quo has state governments in the United States. That's why New York does not control all of the representation and all of what happens in the United States. Smaller groups, cities, towns, and states have representation because groups know that founders of our Constitution knew that you need the actual ability to ensure that local groups are able to advocate for themselves. That is what this system is doing. We're allowing people to advocate for themselves. Additionally, they don't actually tell you why mimicking the democratic system is uniquely good here. We tell you that having multiple unions where workers are able to advocate for their jobs and their unique needs are actually a really good thing in this situation, even if it doesn't mimic the presidential system. On their effectiveness argument, they give you a lot of these scenarios about how a united group is more effective than a bunch of divided groups and a bunch of different ones. They tell you that it's going to lead to competition and manipulation by the market. But Judge, we tell you that they ignore the nuances and the fundamental way which unions work. Use the Amazon example again. If I'm a shipper, right, and all of the shippers in a union go on strike so that these shipping unions can't work, right, there are no shippers, we tell you that that's going to mean that the union literally cannot function. Amazon cannot function without shippers, which tells you that the unions are actually going to be effective. If all of the workers in one job walk off, then that's essentially going to mean that the union is working and the Amazon company or whoever is forced to adhere to the demands of the union. What this actually means is that unions are actually going to have more representation for their workers. If I'm a shipping union person, I might have different needs than that of a packer union person or that of an executive, etc., which essentially means that you should be voting for our side on this point because we are allowing for effective unions. Additionally, my opponents simply ignore the way which the status quo is working right now. Use the example of the Amazon unions in this case, Judge. We tell you that right now, Amazon is manipulating their workers so that unions cannot exist. It doesn't matter if unions are effective or not, if they simply do not exist in the status quo. Amazon has been trying to get workers since the 90s, and the issue here is that companies like Amazon are able to manipulate their workers under the threat of being fired to vote no on union laws. What that means, and by taking away this 50% threshold, we're allowing for unions to pop up without a vote, which means it's a less risk to the workers, which means that more people are able to participate. We're increasing the number of people in union jobs and thus increasing their effectiveness. On their checks and balances point, they tell you that workers are going to work politically and these unions are somehow going to compete against each other. But Judge, number one, they ignore the empirics of the way the system is actually working in countries like France. We don't see competition. We don't see unions competing against each other, because why would they? There's no incentive for unions with different sectors to compete against each other, because unions don't actually get any benefit except for their workers. So we tell you, in a situation where there is a large union and workers want to unionize into one situation, well, they have the ability to do that. But if we need different sectors, then we also have the ability to do that under the affirmative plan. The affirmative side gives choice, while the negative affirms the status quo in which no action is taken and companies like Amazon are still able to manipulate their workers. Let's go on to the affirmative case. The first argument in response to our stuff, specifically in the Amazon example, is that somehow the votes will continue if there isn't a 50% vote. But they ignore the actual fundamental reality of the current situation. We're seeing that all that's going to mean is that there are going to be no unions. Amazon workers have been trying for over 20 years to unionize with these different votes, and this was actually the biggest effort so far. But the issue is getting a majority of workers, even in a local town, is really difficult. Number one, because of the threats, and number two, because unions aren't actually always representing people. Again, the packing versus shipping example. I don't know what the benefits of joining a union are, thus I am less likely to join it. So they tell you that votes are going to continue, and that's precisely the problem, right? The problem is that workers aren't able to unionize under the current system, which is what the negative is advocating for, because workers aren't able to actually unionize through like Amazon competition efforts, etc. On our representation argument, they concede the argument when we tell you that workers aren't getting any representation in the status quo. That's really important when you consider the fact that the negative is adhering to the status quo, where unions in the United States are broken and simply unable to form in big tech companies and in other areas. So we tell you have to be voting affirmative in this round for any shot at actually solving the broken system right now. On the link layer, they tell you that the effectiveness of the system versus it should be valued more than the representation. And we tell you that it doesn't necessarily need to be a contest. By voting affirmative, you're going to be both increasing the effectiveness and the representation of unions. So let's look at why. Representation of unions is going to increase under the affirmative plan because more workers are going to be represented. Again, packing versus shipping example. If I'm a worker, I'm able to get more representation. And we're seeing this in countries like France, right? Where union participation is up and quality of life is up as a result. So we tell you that this argument just simply does not make sense when you consider the fact that effectiveness and representation can increase together. But additionally, we tell you that there cannot be effectiveness of a union without representation. If a union isn't representing the largest number of workers, even when there are different types of unions, if the overall union market is not representing everyone, then the company is allowed to discriminate against specific people, which leads to a spillover where more and more workers are not getting represented by the current system. That's what we're seeing in the status quo. Their final response to the affirmative case is this example with France. They tell you that France isn't having effective union laws in the status quo. They tell you that there's a lot of violence right now and that there's actually significant issues. The fundamental point which they misunderstand is that the protests which they were characterizing were actually, number one, due to a gas tax and thus not related to unions, even though a lot of union workers were there. But number two, Judge, we tell you that a lot of unions in France, according to Jacobin magazine, the violence is decreasing under these unions and the participation in these types of violence is decreasing. And that's uniquely because unions are having new workers and are having new leaders, which essentially means that the French system is working because it's allowing for the most democratic system to happen where the largest numbers of workers are represented. And we also know that workers have higher quality of life and higher pay in countries like France. That's why we're seeing a higher minimum wage. That's why we're seeing higher benefits for workers in France, because workers in France have more lobbying power because of our system. So we tell you that under our system, based on real-world examples and analytics, Judge, we tell you that we're just simply winning on this question, not to mention the logical simplicity of our plan, which we're just simply winning on here. So let's weigh the two arguments, what happens in the affirmative versus the negatives world. Judge, under the negatives world, as a reminder, the status quo, they do not do anything to fix the issues of democracy or effectiveness or checks and balances. We told you that right now the company is railing against these unions and they aren't actually even able to organize in the first place. Workers' rights are being taken advantage of under the current US system. So you're already voting affirmative on the question of representation, because not only are we increasing the effectiveness of unions because they have more political power, see France, but we're also increasing the representation of workers, which means that the United States government or the companies can't actually discriminate against smaller portions of workers, like we're seeing with Amazon in these local Alabama areas. So for all these reasons, based on representation and effectiveness, as well as the negative team is advocating for the status quo, you should vote affirmative.
Okay, let me set up my time. So, Judge, I will start with my rebuttals and go to my my substantive cases. So, going right on to our rebuttals, our previous speaker first told you about how democracy and where small groups are more beneficial in democracy. They tell you about how, look, under US, there's New York. First, we want to tell you that within unions, there are various groups. However, the union has power to represent America, same as America right now. There are stats, but Biden represents America, and the House is ruled by majority party. And secondly, going on, yes, you can have New York, California, New Jersey, but they should all be united as the United States to be able to fight against Russia. This exactly shows you that unification is crucial for unions to have power, especially we clearly tell you from my previous, speaker, we clearly tell you about how one strong union is much more effective than small 20 unions that do not even have power. Going on, they rebutted that Amazons are manipulating, and they tell you about how, look at the status quo. First, we want to rebut about how it's going to be worse under the government's case. When unions are weak, it's even easier for Amazon to crush small unions. So this clearly showed you about how this is ineffective. But secondly, we see no rebuttals on our second argument. Having so much groups competing without integrated support creates over-competitive environment that is extremely easy for corporations to manipulate. Going on, they thirdly tell you about how unionization is difficult in the status quo. First, Judge logically observed the situation. Even when strong, powerful, and integrated mega corporations are powerful enough to mitigate, we clearly see how some are failing, and these, even though like these strong like unions are there, like one single union, it's very easy for them to fail, and a lot of cases are unsuccessful. Then look at the case where there's 20 unions which has only 5% of power. Even it can't compare to one strong union. We clearly see how this is these 20 individual units, they have no power to fight against them. And when looking at when we compare one strong nation and 20 weak unions, and when one strong union even fail, we clearly see how 20 small unions is going to fail. But secondly, on the other hand, we have constant efforts to create a single group, forcing groups to integrate and become stronger. This is why our side has at least a better probability to have unions that are effective. So, Judge, so we clearly tell you about how we value effectiveness rather than meaningless and small unions. We clearly tell you about how one union is much more effective, much more stronger than multiple small unions, as the government team is clearly arguing. We clearly value effectiveness we clearly tell you about how effectiveness is important, because during that time, people is going to be protected. People are going to be protected under the union laws when there is a union, when there's a strong union that is actually going for people's rights, but rather when we tell you about when there's like multiple small unions, we clearly tell you about how in that period these people cannot be protected. These people do not have protection because their union isn't strong. Therefore, we clearly tell you about how if we value effectiveness, and effectiveness is much more important then even though we bite the bullet that representation isn't really represented in when there's a lot of effectiveness. So going on to our case, we clearly told you about how simplified, because there is a simplified bargaining structure, there is going to be much more better. There's going to be much more effectiveness when there's one union. When there's a lot of units, it becomes very complicated as each union seeks to negotiate with management, and with single union agreement, only one union will be able to represent the workforce, and this simplifies the bargaining structure, as we told you from my first argument. In this way, the management will be able to effectively deal with and negotiate with the union and pertaining to labor-related issues. But secondly, we clearly tell you about how reducing by having one single union structure, this will reduce competitive multi-unionism. As we tell you, when there's a lot of unions, their companies is going to manipulate these individual structures. They're going to pick their favorites, and with these, we see that it's going to be very ineffective, or it's rather going to harm these individual unions at the end of the day. Therefore, because of these easily manipulative unions, we clearly see that this is going to be very ineffective when there's small unions in the end. But also, we clearly told you about how there is going to be a check and balance system in our case, because these unions need to get over 50% of votes. The one small union, one powerful union will encourage other people, and union will make integrative policies to actually become much more effective and much more stronger than compared to small unions. Therefore, overall, we clearly told you about how there's going to be much more benefits, there's much more effectiveness going for our case, whereas we see no effectiveness or no power for these small unions to have when there are multiple unions. Therefore, we're proud to oppose. Thank you.
All right. Is everyone ready? Okay. Just as an off-time robot, I'd like to just go over the clashes and try to explain why we had to win those clashes. Just a clarification, my speech is 4 minutes, right? Okay, thank you. My speech starts in 3, 2, 1. So ladies and gentlemen, we think that there is a single reason why side negative has to win this debate. It's because of one word, because of effectiveness. Because even if, yes, we lose all the representation, we don't have various very good unions. The thing is, we have unions that actually do something compared to side opposition, where they have unions that are there, but they just represent you. They're just like political parties. They're just like your representation, your views, your political ideologies, but they don't do anything to actually protect you. We think that when that comparison is there, because we're the side that actually protects the rights of these workers, we're the side that has to win this debate. Directly upon to our team's 2 clashes throughout this entire route. Our first clash will be about the effectiveness vs representation. Judge, let me repeat. If I win this clash, if we prove that we win this important clash, we think that we have to win this entire debate. Why is this so? Because we think that side government's entire case was based on representation, and it's beneficial, and it will be there. Therefore, even if we do lose representation, but we still prove you that effectiveness is there and is a much more important and impactful value, you have to argue that it has to be side negative that wins this debate. Then why is this so? First of all, you have to understand the impact comparison, which was never rebutted or discussed when I clearly talked about it within my first speaker. I told you there are 2 reasons why effectiveness and protecting rights is much more important. First of all, the purpose of unions in and of itself is to protect the rights of the people and to make sure that the corporations are not abusing their own workers. When this is the purpose of unions in and of itself, it's not to politically represent you, it's not to be a representative of you, right? It's not there to be an ideology or something that represents you politically, right? We think that when this is the entire purpose, we think that the side that wins effectiveness fulfills the direct role of these unions, actually fulfills and will be the side that actually wins this debate. But secondly, we proved you that enormous impact, the amount of time frame, the amount of sacrifice these workers have to go through by going on strikes, not paying wages, by being threatened by the corporation, right? We think that the side that actually protects the living conditions is the side that actually wins effectiveness, and the effectiveness of these unions to quickly get the bargaining done and to be able to have policies that actually protect the workers' rights. Having this said, we clearly believe that because there was no rebuttal, it's clear at this point of this debate that effectiveness is a much, much more important value in compared to representation at the end of the day. Then why is our side having much better effectiveness at the end of the day? Let us just look at affirmative's best case scenario. Amazon doesn't crush the small unions, right? They still exist. But we clearly believe that the reason why Amazon wouldn't crush these small unions is because they're not a threat in and of itself, and they don't do anything to threaten them or actually change or give workers better rights. Why is this link true? Why is this logic true? It's simply because of the entire logic that side government used, which is repeated by our second speaker. Just look at the status quo. Even if there's mega unions, all these unions integrating, trying to be strong, trying to get together, they're still not being able to do something because Amazon is just too powerful, too manipulative, and too strong and strategic, being able to manipulate and stop the growth of these unions. Therefore, when you see side government's case where they dilute all that support, when they chop these unions up, that is destroying that enormous amount of support, and that is simply making it impossible. We don't think that this is a new material. This was simply entirely repeated over and over by me and my second speaker throughout our constructive speeches. This is exactly why, even in their best case scenario, affirmative has to lose this debate because they're the side that does nothing. On the other hand, we have unions where we actually have effectiveness, where we're actually doing something, right? Even if, yes, we have one outlier called Amazon where it's just too strong enough even for mega unions to be there. We already see a lot of examples in like Chicago, all those like Ford or whatnot, where unions are extremely strong and are able to protect their citizens better. Therefore, we think that just by this entire one clash, we have won this debate overall. But let us go to our smaller clashes about the check and balance, right? We clearly told you that we also have the benefits of diversity. They never actually directly attacked our logic link. That was basically that. In order for you to become the majority, in order to make sure that you become the main representative when so much is at stake. If you lose this vote, you're losing your entire rights of representation. I clearly told you within my third argument that these unions have the incentive to integrate and to have much better policies and to integrate other policies. Therefore, we're the side that also has a certain degree of representation. Because we not only have a certain degree of representation, but we are the side that actually does something compared to the other side. We're more than happy to win this debate because we're the side that protects people and actually has the unions fulfilling their overall purpose. Therefore, we're more than happy to negate. Thank you.
Cool. Let me grab some water and then I'll give my speech. Okay, so before I begin my speech, what I'm going to be covering is going to be the negative kind of core arguments, and then the affirmative arguments, and then the reason why the affirms. Cool. All good? Cool. Okay, time starts now. Judge, my opponents try to tell you that the effectiveness of unions is the only thing that matters. Let me put you in a scenario. Say, for example, you're a worker working at Amazon. You ship packages for a living. That's what you do. And you are in the minority. Your union, which your peers voted for, which they supported, only supports that of the shippers, or only supports those of the packers. It supports the opposite of you. It supports people who don't believe in, say, for example, reducing the gender equality pay gap between you and your peers. Something that an employee or something that a union, which you didn't vote for, is basically the negative wants to tell you that we should be prioritizing the effectiveness of the entire union over trying to, say, reduce the amount of employment gap or pay gap between you and your peers. This is what the negative is advocating for. They try to tell you that effectiveness trumps all. It doesn't. Actually having representation in your union far outweighs any kind of effectiveness for a union for one key reason. One, representation is the internal link to effectiveness. Without representation, you cannot have an effective union. Now, let's go into my opponent's arguments. There are two key arguments that weaker unions are a lot worse, or that 20 weaker unions are a lot worse than one larger union. We tell you, look at our France example. This isn't happening in France. All the different unions in France, all the people who wanted to have representation with their specific union created their own union, and all the unions are basically like banding together and increasing their political power with these companies in order to actually represent themselves. One union doesn't always have to be the only solution to all of our problems. We give you examples in France where we tell you that people created their own unions. There are a lot of different unions. There are 20 different unions, and all these unions came together to agree upon specific things to increase their political power, to rally against these big mega corporations, which they tell you are manipulating these smaller unions. The reality is, look to France. This isn't happening. Furthermore, we tell you that in France, these unions are actually reducing the amount of violence. They try to come up here and talk about how unions are creating violence. No, the unique reason this violence is going down is because these different unions are actually allowing for the representation of these people in the first place. Actually having representation probably incentivizes workers to be doing more work and actually care about their job, rather than the negative, which they try to tell you the effectiveness of the entire union is more important than actually having your rights represented in that union. Now, on to the second argument. Their second argument is about larger companies and larger mega corporations are going to be manipulating unions in order to basically manipulate votes and basically destroy the entire system. We tell you that no, that's what's happening right now. The entire reason why we need to abolish this law is because Amazon workers have tried to unionize for the past 20 years, and Amazon is basically putting a propaganda campaign into all of these workers and stopping their unionization because of this 50% law, because of this majority law. The exact argument which they try to tell you will happen when we abolish this case or when we abolish this law is actually happening right now. And it's probably a reason why you need to be abolishing this law, because Amazon is taking advantage of this law to actually stop the unionization attempts of their employees and stop the representation and effectiveness of their unions. This probably means that abolishing this law via voting affirmative is a prerequisite to any kind of negative argument which they make. Because we tell you that Amazon and other mega corporations, which they tell you about, are literally using this exact law to do exactly what they are saying right now in the status quo. Now, let's move on. The next argument is about, oh no, unions are going to be competing with each other. I'd like to extend the France warrant. No, they literally aren't. Smaller unions, people who actually want to have their rights represented by unions and not just don't want to have a majority of the population's right represented by the unions, are allowed to create their own unions and solve this whole Amazon problem, to solve and is what's happening right now in France, and do exactly what France is doing. Smaller unions should be prioritized over larger unions because they actually give representation to the people. You shouldn't be prioritizing 51% just because it's the majority. The other 49% have a representation too. They should have representation, and these smaller unions allow for this to happen in the first place, which probably means voting for these smaller unions by rejecting this massive 50%, massive overarching exclusivity union argument is probably a reason why you should be voting affirmative. Now, let's compare some of the reasons why you're voting AF. The first reason you're going to be voting AF is for representation. The second reason you're going to be voting AF is because representation is the internal link to effectiveness. Not having representation literally means you can't have effectiveness within a union. If my ideas aren't represented, how are my ideas supposed to be propagated effectively? If my right under the union to actually make sure that my pay is equitable is not represented, how am I going to have that idea of gender and pay equality actually be effective in that union if the union doesn't even care about me? All their arguments they make are fundamentally solved by this France warrants, but also the entire idea that smaller unions actually represent people. I don't get my ideas represented. I don't get my opinions represented in a giant union where they have to appeal to the majority. Instead, smaller unions can actually appeal to the minority, but can actually appeal to the minority and get things done like what's happening in France right now. All right, a strong vote for the affirmative. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. I submitted now. Sorry for the delay. And I'm happy to talk about reason for decision. Talia, do you want to start, or should I go for it?
I can go first. Let me just
Awesome.
double check because it'll. Cool. Okay. So good job, everyone. First of all, congratulations. You're at the TOC. Yay. Fantastic job. Everyone's a great debater. This round was interesting because you both agree that unions are good throughout the whole round, and then neither side has a ton of direct access to actually helping unions. There are a lot of arguments made, but there's not that much clash. The only kind of key points I am getting are this idea of are smaller unions a weakening force or are they fine? And I get some argumentation from both sides, but ultimately on that point, the neg block did not do enough work to actually to establish that this is weakening these unions significantly. And we have this example of France, and they kind of throw out that, oh, well, they all work together. And so they it doesn't diminish their power because it serves people. And somehow when they're all these smaller unions, they're able to work together and they can put aside all their differences. And once they exist in the first place, then they can work together. But they can't work together from the start because they're not even getting off the ground. And that doesn't really get responded to. So even though the AF argument here is not that strong or well warranted, or the logic is not that great, there's just not enough work done by the negation. So I end up kind of buying that they're not really weaker. And then at that point, the only offense on the negation side is this idea of checks and balances. And it's true, the government doesn't respond to that very well or at all. I don't have very much on my flow, but it ends up not mattering because at the point where both teams agree that unions are good, I probably I buy that, we want to help women and everyone in the workforce. That's not really impacted out that well. It doesn't end up mattering that much. The main actual impact in the round is what's going to happen with unions, because both sides tell me the most important thing is to give unions more power and to help them because they solve everyone's life. Nothing else can really bring the negation back. And so I end up voting for the government team this round. And both teams did a great job. The strategy that the government went with and the way that this round played out would not work in every situation because, again, you don't have that many impacts. And this France example kind of carries you through the round. So I think, both teams are good debaters. There were good arguments on both sides. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Talia. I also want to congratulate all you guys on being at nationals. That's amazing. And also on a great debate. I think this motion was a little constraining and we didn't see too much creative argumentation throughout the whole debate, but it's not entirely your fault. It was a hard motion. So Talia talked a lot about the French example, and I would like to focus on when we talked about Amazon here, because for a lot of this debate, I think I was siding with the opposition on their argument of efficacy. I think they did a great job sort of proving why a strong union has a lot of power. But then at some point, I think it was in the member of the government speech, the point was brought up that Amazon couldn't function without their packers or shippers, I forget which one of the minority groups, because they are so essential to their business. And despite there being a minority group, if there was a smaller union that represented them, it would still be effective. And I was like, that's a great point. I am now siding with government here. And I think that specific one never got contested by the opposition. So that was actually a big factor for me in making my decision and why I went with the government here in general. I think you should all be really proud of yourselves. I think the opposition brought up great points in general. And it could have gone either way. I think it really came down to specific warrants made and which one stood. I'm also happy to answer any questions if you have them.
Yeah, I just had a quick comment here about the weird government structure speech. So it turns out this bill is actually two different bills passed at two different times, which do two different things. So sorry, the case construction of the PMC or the first Prime Minister's speech was a little rusty, but yeah, I just wanted to mention that because this is a weird res. I agree. But great job both debating. Great job debating opponents as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually was wondering why people didn't actually talk about what the law was, and I guess that's the answer, which is that the resolution was not the best.
Yeah, I would have liked them just to to specify like which bill number it was, but I guess this it was a good debate though. It was nice clash of both sides. Yeah.
Okay, I think we have time, but anyone have any questions for us about